But while I was there, I learned about the difference between redemptive and non-redemptive suffering. I learned that they're both totally miserable, but redemptive suffering, you get someplace. And at the end of that time, I also got involved with what I call another tract of my spiritual life. So I had my Christian, what I might call my biblical theological tract, my Quaker tract, and this was the third tract. In the late 60s and in the 70s, there was this new theology being written about called liberation theology. And it was being written about mainly by Catholics, and it was focused on the poor and the oppressed. And the way this theology developed was it really came out of the social gospel. It took Jesus' words very seriously when he quotes Isaiah, and he says, I came to give release to the captives, recovery of sight to the blind, to set at liberty those who are oppressed, to proclaim the acceptable year of the Lord. And although this theology began by dealing with Central America and South America, it then began to spread into other areas, and it began to impact the women's movement. So when I was graduating seminary in 1976, there was a new theology starting called the feminist liberation theology. Now, when I first heard about this, to me the word feminist was about the hottest little word you could ever get near, and I wanted nothing to do with it. To me, that word meant you will never get married. Here's my husband over here. And it also meant that no one would ever want you. But I was in the bookstore one day, and one of my friends was there, and she said, Linda, have you read any of these books? And I said, heavens, no, absolutely not. No way, I wouldn't touch those. She said, oh, I was interested in what you thought. Now, anyone who wants my opinion, you'll get it. So I said, well, what should I read? And she says, well, these three. These are the three you should read. And I said, okay. Well, these three books really changed my life. And one of the reasons they did is that all of us, in order to express our God-given gifts, really have plenty of obstacles out there. We've all got difficulties. We've all got things that we come against. But those of us who are either women or minorities have an extra obstacle because of how our society and our culture thinks of us. And the difficulty in that obstacle is not only are we dealing with that obstacle, we're also dealing with how we've internalized that and what we think of ourselves. So for us to become empowered and liberated, we are really dealing with both the inner self and what's out there in society. So it becomes kind of a difficult thing to separate that. I wanted to know if my religion could help empower me and liberate me and actually reinforce and support what I had experienced as a call. So I decided after reading these books I would do my own study. I started out with the Gospels because I wanted to know, what did Jesus think of people like me? What did Jesus think of women? And I studied those backwards and forwards, and my conclusion is that Jesus was an extraordinary, extraordinary man in how he thought and what the liberation was. And when I look at the Gospels, I find nothing except liberation. I find it absolutely profound. I then went to the Adam and Eve story, which has really set up a great deal of our theology, and looked at that, upward, downward, looked at all sorts of commentaries about it, and saw very clearly, domination came after the fall. Partnership and harmony is the natural state before. So through this, I began to sense that my religion could support my own liberation. As I went forward, I taught for a while, and then in 1981, as I entered the industry, I realized the truth was no one was waiting for me. No one wanted me. No one had heard of any of my skills. They couldn't have cared less. And I felt this kind of movement about starting my own business. Paul Tillich, who's a Protestant theologian, talks about the leap of faith. And there's a funny thing about the leap of faith because you don't always know if it's a leap of faith or just sheer stupidity. And I remember feeling like I was on that abyss and sensing that, could I make this work? Could I start this business which I really felt was an expression of my skills and my gifts and my preparation? And so I sort of said, okay, I'm going to just, after a lot of prayer, like, okay, I'm going to go forward with this. As I started into my business, it wasn't like I was an instant success, that I somehow squeaked by. In fact, I still can't figure out how I made it those first few years, because if you look at income and outgo, they just don't fit together, you know. But somehow I did. And after struggling for a couple years, I got to thinking about what was between me and success. Because I thought, I've gone through all this preparation, presumably I have talent in some way, and yet something is happening. I can't get past this barrier. And I had been in some way presuming that that barrier came from God. You know, the old spiritual test is, let's see how hard we can make it. But I looked and I thought, maybe it's not. Maybe that barrier is actually coming from me. Maybe it's fear of success, maybe it's fear of failure, maybe it's that I'm not strong enough, maybe I don't know enough. There might be something that I have to look at. So the first thing I did was I said to God, whatever is between me and success, I'm willing to deal with it. And if that means I have to look at things inside myself that I don't like, okay. If it means I have to get more assertive, okay. Whatever that means, I will deal with it. And I said, and I trust that if it gets to be real hard, you will send me a therapist who's very cheap. and actually, I did get a very cheap therapist because I started going to the youth center, and I worked actually for 6 years with one of the students there who was very good and worked with me very well. But the second thing I realized is I thought my relationship with God is basically a relationship of it's not fair, whining a lot. And if you know Stand By Me, you'll know it's not fair comes from that movie. And so I thought, what's going to happen if I got to be successful? Because I will probably feel I have no need of God. Because my whole relationship with God was help me get through this struggle. And suddenly, why would I need God anymore if I already was successful? So I realized that it was not in God's best interest under those circumstances to make me successful. So I made another deal with God. And this was a promise. And I said, I promise that even if I get successful and think I don't need you, I promise I will not desert you. I will go to Quaker meeting, I will read my Bible, I will pray, and I will trust that somehow through a period of time, these things will all come together and we will reconstitute and reknit a different kind of relationship. Now it's interesting because I think it took 8 to 10 years to realize that there was a lot of good that can become out of somebody who is successful because you have more power, you have more clout, you have more connections. I mean, there's a whole lot of good you could do, but it took me a while to realize that. As I was entering into this period after I started my business, I also realized one needs God a great deal because we are always hitting frustration, disappointment, rejection. We're dismissed, discounted, disparaged, and neglected and ignored. And that becomes, extremely difficult to deal with that. Along the way, we meet all the 7 deadly sins. We meet envy and covetousness and lust and anger. And then pride when things start getting a little better. The only one that was really fun was gluttony. Gluttony, aside from the after effects, was wonderful, and I can tell you where all the best desserts are in Los Angeles as a result. And the only one that really in our industry I don't think we meet is sloth, because although I have many friends who wish that I met sloth a little more, it says, please, you're working too hard. As I began to move through this period of time after my business started, I also began to look at what could I do from my position. For one thing, was I began to be very interested in this whole area of how the media portrays women, because we know that most of the time is limited and many times it's really degrading. And I looked for some kind of opportunity to do something about that. I was asked to be chair of a committee for women in film where we created criteria for an award for the positive depiction of women in the media. This was called the Luminous Award, and it was given out in 1986. It was only given 1 year, and it was probably my greatest professional disappointment that that award did not continue. But then I said, quoting from Maria von Trapp, God never shuts a door without opening a window, she's one of my favorite theologians, that I began to say, I wonder how I could take what I've learned about stereotyping and do something different with it. So I decided to do a chapter in my book on creating unforgettable characters, and then I also decided to write a whole book on women and women's impact on the industry to see if that could move things a little bit. As I was getting ready to write this book, I had a dream about going back to study theology. Rather than wait until this push became a shove, I said, I got it, I understand, I will. And I knew exactly what I wanted to do. I wanted to study feminist liberation theology at Immaculate Heart College. And I have done this now since January '94, and I'm getting a master's in that in June 25th. And that helped me, for one thing, is it helped inform my work with women. It also began to get me to think, where is my responsibility? What can I do? One of the places I saw that I could do something was I recognized that I was the only woman traveling abroad teaching. So I set out to ask myself, who are the really good women teachers here, and how could I use my position in relationship with these people hiring to give people addresses, to recommend women, etc. I figured out that there were 8 men that were traveling abroad and me, and I set out to try to make that as equal as possible. And it took 2 years, but 2 years later there were 8 women that had gone to Europe and had taught. One of the things that I have gotten from my study of feminist theology the last few years has been, feminist theology talks a lot about our stories. It says our stories are important, that telling our stories, looking at our stories, sharing our stories can be a very holy and sacred act. In fact, in a sense, in the Judeo-Christian heritage, this is what we do. We look at the stories of Abraham and Sarah and Moses and Miriam and the woman at the well and all these stories, and we look at them to find meaning and to bring meaning to them. And so storytelling is extremely important. It's in a sense, we could say it's a theological thing to do. So that when we are telling stories, we are really pulling in meaning. And our stories about whether they're our struggles, our transformations, our visions, our desires, our concerns, all of these things are extremely important for us to do to, we might say, to build up the earth, to build up the good in the world. One of my favorite lines comes from Room with a View, that Mr. Emerson says to Lucy Honeychurch. He says, my son George is very muddled. And he says, help him to understand that beside the everlasting why, there is a yes and a yes and a yes. In a sense, we, in looking for our meanings and in telling our stories, can say, why do we deal with all the struggle, all the pain, all the frustration, all the disappointments? Because we know that beside all those whys, there is a yes and a yes, and there is that everlasting yes that lights our paths. Thank you.